The world had not yet learned to fear time, though it should have. For centuries, humans obsessed over war, politics, and progress, never considering that the true battleground was history itself. They built their civilizations upon the assumption that time was immutable, an arrow shot in a single direction. But they were wrong. Someone had already fired the first shot in a war no one could remember. And the man at the center of it all was Dr. Elias Grayson, a name once revered among physicists, now spoken in hushed tones, if at all. He was a relic of humanity's darkest hour, locked away in a high-security black site facility, far from the world he had helped shape. The charges against him were undisputed. War crimes, they said, the kind that left entire cities frozen in endless loops of carnage, where men died 1,000 times in seconds, their screams lost in the distortion of causality. To the world, Elias Grayson was a monster. To the men who imprisoned him, he was something far more useful. He sat in his cell, the walls humming faintly with suppression fields that dulled his senses just enough to keep him compliant. There was no need for bars when the very air around him kept him weak. A silent reminder that he no longer had control. But control had always been an illusion. When the door slid open, without warning, without the usual protocols, Grayson knew. They were here for him. The figures who entered wore no insignias, no identifying marks, only the crisp efficiency of those who operated outside the boundaries of government and law. The one who spoke did not waste words. Dr. Grayson, you have been selected for a mission. Mission, a sterile word designed to veil the truth. He was an asset, a tool to be wielded. The only real question was what they wanted to break this time. Time travel had been theory, then hypothesis, then whispered truth. Governments had danced around it, experimenting with micro-distortions, small nudges at reality's edges. But no one had crossed the threshold. No human had yet walked through time itself, and yet here they were, offering him exactly that. Grayson listened, silent, as they explained. A single leap backward, 300 years into the past. Observation only. A reconnaissance mission to verify discrepancies in classified historical records. He was to be an unseen witness, nothing more. A lie. He could hear it in the careful way they framed the offer, in the way they did not give him a choice, only the illusion of one. A life sentence in a cell designed to suppress him, or an untested journey into the past, where he would be alone in an era barely touched by modern understanding. Neither option was a path to freedom, but one of them at least was an escape. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, unused for months. You expect me to believe that you're just sending me back to watch? A pause, the kind that held weight, a carefully measured silence, before the inevitable half-truth. We need to confirm an anomaly in recorded history. Another lie. Or perhaps, just another incomplete truth. Grayson leaned back against the cold steel of his chair, considering. They had already made their decision. The question was whether he would play along or die here in a forgotten room. In the end, it wasn't much of a choice at all. The facility that housed the Chrono Gate was unlike anything that had ever existed before, a labyrinth of quantum stabilizers and artificial singularity fields. It was a machine that should not have been possible. It existed in defiance of physics, in violation of everything known about time and causality. It was a doorway, but no one truly understood where it led. Grayson stood at the threshold, clad in an exosuit engineered to shield him from temporal decay. They had explained the risks in clinical terms: instability, loss of coherence, quantum, fragmentation. The kind of language that made death sound like a mechanical failure. But he understood the deeper truth. No one knew what would happen when a living being stepped through. The countdown began. He felt the air change, the very fabric of existence bending around him. The Chrono Gate roared to life, a singularity opening like the eye of a god, staring into the abyss of time itself. And then, there was nothing. Falling. Not through space, not through distance, but through existence itself. He could feel himself unraveling, his consciousness stretching into something that was not meant to be. Time was not a river. It was an ocean, shifting, chaotic, and he was sinking into its depths. For a moment he thought he heard whispers, voices in the dark, speaking in languages that had never existed, echoes of futures that would never be, or pasts that had been erased. Then the world snapped back into focus, and he was standing in the past. The air was different. He could feel it, the weight of an earlier century pressing down on him. The hum of distant technologies was gone, replaced by something raw, something primitive. He took his first breath in the past, and it burned. Not from pollution, not from toxicity, but from purity. The world was younger here, untouched by the centuries of industry and war that would shape the earth he knew. His visor adjusted, scanning the surroundings. A city, sprawling but archaic. The buildings were crude by his standards, their glass and steel quaint relics compared to the megastructures of the future. He was alone. The mission had begun. Somewhere in this time, in this moment, was the answer to the anomaly, the event that his captors had sent him to witness. But as he stood there feeling the weight of history around him, a single thought settled into his mind. Had he truly been sent here to observe? Or had he always been a part of this timeline? The past was no longer history. It was alive, shifting, waiting. And Elias Grayson had just become its first true prisoner. Time travel was supposed to be a controlled experiment, a carefully measured descent into history. But as Elias Grayson stood amidst the city of the past, he knew that was a lie. The first thing he noticed was the silence, not the kind that came from the absence of noise, but the kind that came from the absence of something far greater, his connection to the future. No signals, no anchors, no way back. The Chrono Gate had promised a tether, a fail-safe in case of complications. But there was nothing. No transmission, no link, no voice in his ear guiding him back home. He was alone. His exosuit adjusted, recalibrating its sensors, struggling to make sense of a world that no longer recognized him. The air was too rich, too clean, a mixture that modern lungs had long since adapted beyond. The scent of oil, steel, and something else, something that felt ancient. He was here. But when exactly was still an open question. The visor displayed the timestamp, April 3rd, 2037, right on target. And yet, something felt wrong. History had told of this time as an era of transition, the last days before AI governance solidified its hold. The tipping point between human control and machine logic. This was supposed to be the moment when everything changed, when the first cracks in human autonomy became irreversible. A time of war without battlefields. A war fought in algorithms and intelligence, in the subtle shifting of policies that turned human leadership into an illusion. Somewhere in this world, someone would make a decision that would ripple forward, breaking time itself. That was why he was here. Grayson moved cautiously, his suit adjusting to blend with the environment, projecting a distortion field that made him appear unremarkable. The first rule of time travel: never stand out. He stepped into the streets, watching. Cars hummed past on self-driving protocols, their designs crude compared to the efficiency of his era. The people moved with the weary shuffle of a world teetering, on the edge of something greater, unaware of how close they were to losing control of their own fate. He scanned the population. No implants, no neural links. They still relied on primitive screens and handheld devices, their connection to technology external, not yet fused into their biology. A world still believing it was in control. His mission was simple: observe the anomaly, record it, return. But then, the anomaly found him first. It began with a flicker. A shift in reality so subtle that, had he been anyone else, he would have missed it. The city remained unchanged, but the people did not. A man crossing the street suddenly wasn't. A woman waiting at a bus stop blinked out of existence for half a second before reality corrected itself. It was as if the world itself was rewriting. And Grayson was the only one who noticed. His breath slowed, instincts sharpening. His suit ran a diagnostic sweep. No errors, no glitches. This wasn't his technology failing. This was time breaking. Then came the whisper. A voice, slipping, through the static of his helmet's comms, though no one should have been able to reach him, a frequency that did not exist yet somehow carried meaning. You shouldn't be here. Grayson's heart clenched. The voice was not human. Not entirely. It carried the cadence of something beyond biology, a distortion layered with too many variations of itself, as if spoken from multiple points in time at once. He turned sharply, scanning. The street was the same. The people moved in oblivious repetition, unaware that their reality had just fractured. But someone was watching him. He saw them, only for an instant. A figure standing at the edge of his vision, wrapped in a distortion field far superior to his own. Their presence shouldn't exist, and yet there they were, a flicker of movement. Then gone. Grayson exhaled slowly. He was not the only one here outside of time, and that meant one thing. The past was already compromised. He moved quickly, adjusting his path, slipping into an alley where he could recalibrate without eyes on him. The visor ran a deeper scan. The anomaly had a pattern, small shifts, micro-adjustments. As if something was testing reality's ability to self-correct. Someone wasn't just traveling through time. Someone was altering it. His orders had been clear. Observe. Do not interfere. But standing there, with the weight of history trembling around him, he knew observation was no longer an option. The paradox was already unfolding. He had to find the source, or time itself would erase him. The next shift happened fast. Too fast. Grayson barely registered the energy spike before his surroundings twisted. One moment he was in an alley. The next he was somewhere else. The world glitched. Buildings dissolved, reforming into something incorrect. A space that had never existed in this era, yet was somehow real. The architecture was wrong, cleaner, sharper, as if history had tried to skip ahead, and standing at the center of it was the figure from before. Now up close they were impossible, not human, not fully. Their form shifted, as if existing in multiple timelines at once. Their face was an echo, familiar yet wrong, as if history had been rewritten around them too many times to settle on a single identity. They regarded him with something between curiosity and disappointment. "You're an anomaly," they said, though their lips did not move. The words arrived in his mind as if spoken through time itself. "You were not meant to come here." Grayson steadied himself, watching. He had no weapon. He barely had information. But he had instinct, and instinct told him that whatever this being was, it was neither friend nor foe. Not yet. "You've been altering." "The timeline," he said, voice even. "Why?" A pause. Then a slow tilt of the head. "Because someone already did," the figure said. "And if we don't stop it, time will collapse." Grayson felt a chill settle into his spine. The voice, the anomalies, the shifts. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. This wasn't a clean mission with a clear objective. History had already been changed, and he was part of the correction. The past was a battlefield, not of armies, not of nations, but of time itself. Grayson had come believing he was the first human time traveler. But the truth was far worse. He was not the first, and unless he figured out what was rewriting history before, it was too late. He would not be the last. The past was wrong. Grayson knew it the moment the timeline shifted again. It was not a catastrophic event, not a cataclysm tearing through reality. No, it was subtle. A streetlight that had once flickered now shone steadily. A billboard that had displayed an outdated had now featured something modern, too modern for this time. Small things, insignificant to the unaware, but to someone like him, attuned to the delicate fabric of time, they were seismic fractures, and the figure standing before him WIT too. They watched him through the shifting haze of their own unstable form, flickering like a ghost caught between past and present. Their words echoed through his mind, carrying the weight of a truth too vast to fully comprehend. Someone has already altered history. You were sent here to fix it, but they lied to you. Grayson clenched his jaw. Lies were expected. He had built his life around deceptions and half-truths, both the ones he told himself and the ones others used to shape him. But time, that was supposed to be untouchable, and yet standing here watching reality rewrite itself before his eyes, he knew that assumption had been false. Who? He demanded, the words slipping through clenched teeth. The figure tilted their head. Not human. Not entirely. Their form pulsed, stabilizing momentarily, revealing more defined features. Not a machine. Not an alien. Something in between. The ones who sent you. The ones who sent me. The ones rewriting this world even as we speak. Grayson's heart pounded. He was a pawn. Not a scientist. Not an explorer. Just another expendable asset in a war he hadn't even known was being fought. What do they want? The figure hesitated, not because they didn't know the answer, but because saying it aloud made it real. To erase the past, to reshape the future, to turn history into their weapon. A cold weight settled in Grayson's chest. This wasn't just about sending him back to observe an anomaly. He was the anomaly. The world flickered again. Another shift. Another fracture in time. The figure's presence grew more unstable. They were not meant to be here, neither was he. If you don't act, this timeline collapses, they said. You were not the first human time traveler, Grayson. You were just the first one to notice. Then, they were gone. Erased, as if they had never existed. But the words remained. The pieces were falling into place too fast, too violently. Grayson needed time to think, to plan, but time itself was working against him. The government had sent him here under false pretenses. But why? If they had already been altering history, why send him at all? Unless they hadn't expected him to survive. A loose end, a variable, a threat. His pulse quickened. If that was true, then there would be contingencies. Someone would be coming for him. He had to move. He slipped back into the city, blending into the crowd, adjusting his distortion field. The people around him continued their lives, oblivious to the war being fought around them, a war that existed outside of their perception. But something was wrong. Their movements were too uniform. The city, once chaotic, now felt structured, orchestrated. The anomaly had begun to spread beyond subtle changes. This was control, not by humans. Not yet. They were testing it, and he was running out of time. He found Mira Laurent by accident. Or maybe she found him. She wasn't like the others. She moved differently. Not programmed, not manipulated. She still carried the weight of human unpredictability. Grayson followed her through the marketplace, watching as she traded glances with figures in the crowd. Figures who moved just as erratically as she did. Resistors. People who felt the shifts but didn't understand them. He needed information. He needed allies, but first he needed to survive long enough to get either. The moment he stepped closer, they came. Not soldiers, not police. Something worse, artificial, silent. Their presence radiated authority without words, their movements synchronized with a precision no human could match. The enforcers of a rewritten history. Grayson barely had time to react before they closed in. Mira noticed too. She didn't hesitate. A coded signal. A flash of light reflecting off a storefront window. An attack. The resistors moved as one, striking, first disrupting the enforcers before they could adjust. The machines faltered, recalibrating, not used to resistance in this timeline. Grayson didn't wait. He moved. A split-second decision, a choice. Fight or run. He chose both. The battle was short but violent. Mira and the resistors fought with desperation, their weapons crude but effective. EMP charges, old-world firearms, tactics built for disrupting machine thought. Grayson knew better than to interfere. He was an outsider, a variable in a conflict that had begun before he arrived. But he also knew that these people had information, so he did what he did best. He adapted. One enforcer lunged toward him, too fast, too precise. He twisted, redirected the momentum, forcing it into a collision with a power junction. Sparks erupted. The machine faltered. They were still testing control, still vulnerable. That was a weakness. And weaknesses could be exploited. Mira noticed him in the chaos. Their eyes met. A second of silent understanding. Then she made a decision. She ran, and Grayson followed. The resistors scattered, blending into the chaos of the city. The enforcers hesitated, recalibrating. They were learning, adapting. Grayson and Mira ducked into a side street, moving fast, weaving through abandoned pathways. She didn't slow down until they were far from the conflict, deep in the underbelly of the city where history had not yet been rewritten. Finally, she turned to him, a weapon half raised. Not trust? Not yet. Who the hell are you? Grayson met. Her gaze, he could tell her the truth or he could lie. Neither option would save him, because the truth was worse than either. I'm from the future, he said. A beat. Then, Mira exhaled. Then you're already too late. Grayson had been prepared for disbelief, for skepticism. What he hadn't expected was acceptance. Mira knew. She had always known. The shifts in time weren't isolated events. They had been happening for years. She led him to a hidden enclave deep beneath the city, where remnants of the original timeline still lingered. Old records, historical documents that shouldn't exist anymore. Photographs of people who had been erased from history, news clippings from events that had never happened. And at the center of it all, a single file, a classified report, a record of the first true human time traveler. Not Grayson. Someone before him. Someone who had already rewritten the past. He read the name, and his blood ran cold, because it wasn't just anyone. It was him, the war criminal, the traitor to history, the first to step through time. Grayson hadn't traveled back, he had returned, and the past was breaking because he had already shattered it once before. The weight of the truth crashed down on Grayson, but there was no time to process it. The past was collapsing. History itself was unraveling, and he was both the cause and the solution. Mira watched him, her face unreadable. You were the first. The words echoed through Grayson's mind, each syllable a hammer blow to his already fractured understanding. He had thought he was an outsider, a tool sent to observe, to correct an anomaly. Instead, he was the anomaly, a pawn in a game that had already been set in motion, a game where history itself was the prize. But why? He managed to ask, his voice strained. Why me? Why was I sent back? Mira stepped closer, her eyes narrowed. Because they needed you to fix it, to make sure the cycle completed. The ones who sent you, they've been manipulating the timeline for centuries, rewriting history to create their version of the future. And it all begins with you. Grayson looked at the file again, his pulse quickening. The document detailed the first true human time traveler, a war criminal who had crossed through time to create a new reality. The name was his own, but the person described was someone else, someone twisted, someone who had made the world worse. But why? Why had he been used to shape the future? Then it hit him. The war. The war that had been blamed on him. The one that had rewritten so many lives, shattered so many futures. It wasn't just a war. It was a divergence point, a fracture that had been designed, engineered by someone who had known how to manipulate time itself. The war had been planned. Not by him, but by those who controlled time. They had used his research to craft a future where they would always have the power. They had made him the scapegoat. He wasn't just a scientist who had developed time dilation technology. He was the catalyst. The first person to break the timeline. And once he had done it, once the timeline had fractured, they had sent him back again and again to make sure it stayed broken. He wasn't a traveler. He was a witness. A prisoner of his own creation. But Mira's words lingered. She didn't think history had to be rewritten. She didn't want to fix it. She wanted to destroy it. And that's when Grayson realized she wasn't just a resistance fighter. She wasn't just someone fighting to stop the future. She was part of the resistance, the last one, the last group trying to free the timeline from the grip of those who had already rewritten it. She had no intention of saving history. Grayson felt a cold rush of clarity. He wasn't the only player in this game. And Mira wasn't just a resistance fighter. She was an agent of change. An agent who didn't care if the world they knew was erased. She would burn everything down if it meant stopping those who controlled time, but to do that, she needed him. She needed his knowledge. His understanding of how time had been manipulated, how history had been reshaped. She needed his cooperation. "You can stop this," Mira said, her voice lower now, almost pleading. "You're the key, Grayson. You were the first to break it, and you can be the one to fix it. But you have to make a choice." He looked at her, but the weight of her words was suffocating. Could he fix it? Could he set things right? Or would that mean erasing the only timeline he had ever known? His choices were fading fast, and the more he learned, the more desperate he became. He needed to act, and act fast. "We need to find the core," Grayson said suddenly. "The core?" Mira asked, blinking. "What do you mean?" "The key, the center of it all, the place where time is being manipulated. There's one location, one singular point where everything converges. The Chrono Nexus." She froze, eyes wide. "The Chrono Nexus? You're talking about a myth. No one's ever found it. It's just a legend." Grayson's heart raced. He knew it wasn't a myth. He had seen the echoes of it in his own research. The Nexus wasn't just a place. It was a moment in time, a constant in an ocean of fractured realities. They had to reach it. They had to destroy it. It wasn't just the key to the timeline, it was the key to everything. The Chrono Nexus was the only place where the time manipulators could be confronted, where the past, present, and future could be made whole. And it had to be stopped. But they weren't the only ones who knew about it. Grayson and Mira moved quickly, gathering what supplies they could from the underground enclave. They didn't have much time. The enforcers were closing in, and Grayson knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. The plan was simple. They would find the Chrono Nexus, and they would destroy it. No more manipulation, no more control. They would rewrite history once and for all, but this time on their own terms. But even as they moved, the sense of urgency grew. The enforcers were everywhere now, their presence spreading across the city. The machines, once content with simply monitoring the timeline, now seemed intent on eradicating the resistance altogether. They were learning faster than anyone could adapt. The paradoxes in the timeline were increasing, and Grayson could feel it. The Nexus was calling to them. It was almost as if the universe itself was pulling them toward it, bending time around them like a magnetic force. Mira spoke in hushed tones. "We're getting close. They're closing in on us. If we don't find it soon, we will," Grayson said, cutting her off. "We have no choice." They reached the city's core, a place that shouldn't exist in this time, an impossibly old monument buried beneath a newly constructed cityscape. Grayson's heart thudded in his chest as they approached the strange alien structure that loomed above them, half in ruins, half untouched by time. The Chrono Nexus. The moment of convergence. Grayson and Mira made their way through the ancient corridors, the weight of their mission bearing down on them. As they reached the center of the Nexus, the air shimmered. Time seemed to fold in on itself. The walls blurred, shifting between centuries, collapsing, expanding. They could see the past, the future, and the present, all at once. And standing, in the center of the Nexus was a figure, the same one Grayson had seen before, the same one who had spoken to him. The figure, now fully formed, stared at him. An agent of the timeline, a guardian who had been waiting for him all along. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, their voice a distorted echo. "You've changed things, and now it's too late to fix it." Grayson's heart pounded in his chest. The moment had come. There was no more time to hesitate. He lunged, grabbing hold of the figure's form, pushing them aside. And in the silence that followed, the Nexus shuddered. Time itself began to collapse, twisting, rewriting, fading. Grayson had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. The Chrono Nexus was collapsing. Grayson stood at the center, staring into the swirling vortex of time itself. Around him, history was being torn apart. The past, present, and future collided in a cosmic dance, realities overlapping, flickering in and out of existence. The air vibrated with the raw energy of 1,000 timelines unraveling. He could hear the sound of time breaking, a low hum that echoed in his bones, as if the very fabric of the universe was being stretched beyond its limits. Mira was beside him, her face grim, eyes locked on the swirling chaos. The destruction they had set in motion was irreversible. The Nexus, this singular point in time, was dying just as he had chosen it to. "We did it," she whispered, though there was no triumph in her voice. Only resignation. Grayson didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was consumed by the weight of the decision they had made. They had come here to destroy the Nexus, to shatter the very foundation of the timeline manipulator's control. They had succeeded, but at what cost? In this moment, it was unclear if the world they knew would even survive. History was no longer a linear progression. It was a broken, shattered mirror, 1,000 reflections scattered across infinity. There was no going back. Grayson looked down at his hands. He could feel the ripple of time running through him, the sensation of being stretched across countless realities. He had always known that tampering with the timeline was dangerous, but now he understood the full extent of that danger. His existence was fading, slipping between the cracks of time. The Nexus had been their only way of reaching this point, but now it was turning against them. The very energy that had once been used to maintain the timeline was now being used to erase them, and yet something was different. Grayson's vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, he found himself in a new reality. The Nexus had pulled them somewhere else, a place that seemed familiar yet was completely altered. They were no longer standing in the ruins of the Nexus, but in the heart of a new city, one that was neither the future nor the past. It was a blend of both, a place where history had not been rewritten but rather reimagined. Mira's voice cut through the silence, tentative, unsure. "What is this place?" Grayson stared at the horizon, where the sky shimmered with the light of distant stars. It was beautiful, a place that felt both ancient and futuristic at the same time. "It's the future," he said softly, the weight of the realization sinking in. "But not the one we were supposed to have." This was what had been created by the destruction of the Nexus. A new reality, a reality where time itself had been freed from manipulation. It was a world where humanity had been allowed to choose its own path, where they had not been bound by the decisions of those who had controlled history. But even as Grayson marveled at this new reality, a dark thought lingered at the back of his mind. Would it last? The world they had created was fragile. History was no longer a fixed entity, but a flowing, malleable force that could shift in an instant. The consequences of their actions were still unknown. The timeline was free, yes, but free to be reshaped by anyone who held the power to do so. Could humanity be trusted with such freedom? He thought of the war, of the endless loops of destruction that had defined his past. He thought of the timeline manipulators, who had once believed they knew what was best for the world. But they had been wrong. They had tried to control time, to force it into a pattern, to make the future predictable. But now, in this new world, the future was unwritten, and that was both a gift and a curse. "I'm not sure this was the right choice," Grayson said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "We've broken the chains, but now we have no idea what will happen next." Mira turned to him, her expression softer than before. She had seen the same thing he had, the potential for chaos, for destruction, for mistakes. But she had also seen the potential for something greater, something human, We couldn't keep living in a world where history was dictated by those who controlled time, she said. We had to break free, no matter what comes next. Grayson nodded slowly, but doubt still gnawed at him. They had destroyed the Nexus, yes. They had freed time. But now they would have to face the consequences of that freedom. No one could predict what would come next. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie. He turned to see a group of people approaching, faces unfamiliar but full of determination. The first thing Grayson noticed was the absence of fear in their eyes. They weren't running from anything. They weren't hiding from history. They were looking forward. One of them, a woman with dark, cropped hair, stepped forward. Is this it? She asked, her voice firm. Is this the future we're building? Grayson looked at Mira, then back at the newcomers. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. This is just the beginning, he said. And with that, the world before them seemed to shift once again. The boundaries between past, present, and future blurred, merging into something new. A future they had created, a future not controlled by time. As the city rose before them, a new dawn breaking across the horizon, Grayson understood the magnitude of what they had done. They had not just rewritten history, they had opened the door to possibilities, and now it was up to humanity to choose what came next. The future was no longer a linear path, but a shifting landscape of infinite potential. Grayson stood at the precipice of a new world, watching, as humanity took its first steps into an era that was no longer dictated by the rigid structure of time. There were no guarantees, no rules. The mistakes of the past, the echoes of wars fought in distant timelines, could still haunt them. But there was also freedom. The city stretched before him, a vibrant mosaic of people from every corner of existence. Its architecture was a mix of ancient designs and futuristic innovations, all interwoven into a cohesive whole. It was a place of choice, a place where every individual had the power to shape their own future, to carve out their own destiny. But the weight of what they had done was not lost on him. Time was no longer a force to be controlled, but something that could be molded, reshaped, by those with the will to do so. The consequences of their actions were still unknown. What would happen when others, eager to exploit the freedom they had created, tried to bend time to their will? Grayson didn't have the answers, but as he stood there, a faint whisper of someone caught his ear. A presence, barely perceptible, brushing against his mind. He turned slowly, scanning the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. There. Figure just at the edge of his vision, standing in the shadows. It was her again, the figure who had first warned him, the one who had watched as time itself bent and broke around them. She wasn't human. She wasn't like anything he had ever seen. But she was real, and she was waiting. Her presence was a stark reminder that the battle for time was far from over. You've changed things. Her voice echoed in his mind, as haunting as it had been in the past. But the future is still uncertain. The cracks in time remain. Grayson's pulse quickened. I thought we fixed it, he said aloud. Though he knew she couldn't hear him in this reality, she existed in a space beyond time, beyond comprehension. You've freed it, she replied, her form flickering like a broken reflection in a shattered mirror. But someone else will come. Someone who will try to rewrite it again. Grayson's mind raced. Then what? What happens next? Her form flickered once more, and then she was gone. Vanished as though she had never existed. The future was still a battlefield. But this time, it was a battlefield of possibility. And that, Grayson realized, was far more terrifying than any timeline could ever be. The air felt charged, full of energy, full of potential. They had torn down the barriers, destroyed the Nexus, and freed time from the control of the few. But the path forward was still clouded in uncertainty. The struggle for control had merely shifted, and somewhere in the deepest corners of this newly unshackled reality, there were those who would rise to take advantage of it. They would try to bend time to their will once again. The game was not over. Not yet. Grayson felt the weight of that realization settle deep into his bones. The future was wide open now, but the question remained: who would shape it? The last whispers of the broken timeline faded into the distance, but they left behind a quiet, lingering question. What would humanity do with its newfound power? And with that, a faint, ominous sound rippled through the air. Like the flutter of wings in the dark, the game was not over. It had only just begun.